Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to the Angelo Robles Podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO of Family Office Association. I have the honor of interviewing and talking to some amazing people. To give some context to my discussions, I help global families and their family offices solve problems, procure positive future outcomes, and prepare for intergenerational necessity. It's vital for families and their family offices to understand their vulnerabilities and become more resilient so they can mitigate risk and prevail during times of crisis. My experience with some of the wealthiest families in the world has allowed me to distill best practices for discovering purpose and refining vision, governance, structures, systems, and the culture that successful families and their safeguard family offices need in order to thrive. Our special session today and guest, it's titled Chairman Mckinsey North America on Companies Reinventing During COVID-19. It features Gary Pinkus, who, as noted in the title, is the Chairman North America for McKinsey. I'd like to read the shortened version. Gary has a stellar background educationally, as you would expect, and has been with McKinsey for over 3 decades. Gary Pinkus is the chairman for McKinsey & Company in North America. He was previously the managing partner for the firm in North America, and before that, led McKinsey's office for the Western United States. He is also the former global leader of McKinsey's private equity and principal investors practice, which he helped co-found almost 2 decades ago. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Angelo. It's exciting to be here virtually.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about your background, which is unique in co-founding the private equity practice, which would be important for my audience of McKinsey, and a little bit of your role now, which is obviously incredibly senior.
Well, the background, I guess, on the practice is going back almost 25 years ago. We began to realize that there was something interesting going on with a group of what at the time were doing mid-market investments. And there was what I'll call in some ways a perfect alignment between the owner, the managers, the investors behind the owner, and eventually us as the consultants to drive fundamental, what I'll call transformational change in a set of companies that were scaled and sized where you could imagine doing so in a relatively short period of time, call it within the PE period time cycle. And it took us a little longer to get to it. 1 or 2 of our competitors got to the sector and came to the realization there was servable clients there faster than we did. But once we arrived, it was sort of the 800-pound gorilla. When they show up at the birthday party, you notice. And a group of us around the world just started serving these clients. And it's been one of the fastest growing practices in our firm now for a number of years.
Well, kudos certainly to you and your team's work, because yes, I guess when people think of McKinsey, the iconic consulting organization, they think of their amazing work with Fortune 500 companies. But to look at the private equity industry and some highly successful organizations in that, and them investing in private companies, that's a different approach and a different target market than has been quote unquote in the past. So you really did have to kind of initiate this from scratch, which was a new initiative a couple of decades ago. What are certain principles that you learned in doing that at McKinsey that helped you be successful in that role?
Well, it may be peculiar to McKinsey, maybe it's peculiar to large global organizations, as you say, that have been around for a while, but one of the critical ones was not to listen to the advice of many people that were senior to me. Which was almost universally along the lines of, this is a stupid idea. They're not servable. They're just going to take our intellectual property and walk away with it. And really what a few of us did was kind of quietly ignore that, start serving these clients, realize that they were servable, made a bunch of mistakes early on, in no small part due to your point, Angelo, which is we knew how to serve big companies. We didn't know how to serve investors, and we didn't know how to serve mid-sized companies. But we learned it, and many times the hard way. And when we finally had something that seemed to be working, we kind of announced it back to the rest of the firm. By the way, here's this new practice we've been quietly building. Who wants to get involved? And everything's kind of rolled from there.
I'm interested because I would think of McKinsey as being a little bit hierarchical, very structured, very successful. And for you to bring the idea to quote unquote superiors and them to kind of say no and you to do your own thing, I almost wonder what you would do now as the boss if someone were to do that against your wishes. I guess the short answer is if you do it, you better be successful at it.
Or quietly bury the bodies at night, as we're fond of saying. There's one of the things I do now, going back to one of your earlier questions, Angelo, is I chair the committee that evaluates all our senior partners. And one of the things I'm fond of saying there is we're very tolerant as a firm for our senior partners to have a noble failure or two. I just wouldn't make a full career of them.
No, then you won't have a career at that company much longer. Is this a new normal that we're seeing now as top of mind for companies in both the private and the public sector? Given COVID-19, how has their decision-making, their strategies changed in today's market?
Well, I think we're a long ways away from anything that feels like a new normal. We're in the middle of, or maybe said differently, maybe it's semantics. We're in the middle of something that is completely non-normal. And as long as it is going on, it will be our normal for the moment, but I don't think we're in anything that feels like an end state or even a medium state. And so to your question, what companies, I think that probably the guiding characteristics of those companies that are successfully navigating this is an incredible nimbleness. And that was not something you would normally have said about many companies that are proving to be more nimble than you might expect. And by nimble, I mean the ability to basically move their entire workforce to home. By nimble, I mean the ability to change their day-to-day operations as regulations change on a per country, per county, per city level. By nimble, I mean the ability to go digital. There's a running meme that was going around a few months ago, which is what's driven your digital strategy. Option A was the CIO, option B was the CEO, option C was McKinsey, and option D was COVID. And I think it's pretty clear everybody is in some version of an option D world right now, except for those who started digitally to begin with.
That is very much for true. One of my projects I did this summer was I interviewed effectively my 7 largest family offices, all above 10 billion, one in the Forbes 20, the executives that run the family office. And the key themes that I heard from them is once we got past the initial shock, we basically realized to some degree we had to reinvent at least our workflow and our operations. And the things that we've been holding off on because we get comfortable doing things a certain way, our technology and our systems, we were forced to learn project management, communication, and oh my God, now that I'm doing this, I should have been doing this years ago. So the great impetus more than anything else is the black swan event in COVID-19. I hate to make it sound like a rosy picture because people have died, people are sick, millions of small business owners may very well not make it, and there's grave, grave challenges. But if you had to look at something with a little bit of a silver lining in the companies that you work with, whether large private companies or public companies, has working remotely helped them? Are they more efficient in their real estate? Are they getting more opportunity with a global workforce? And are they advancing using technology that they should have started years ago?
I think the last part of your question is the easiest one to answer, which is, I think, almost across the board, those who can are advancing technologically with something. You can debate whether or not they should have started years ago or could have accelerated, perhaps. And what COVID's done is cause what might have happened over a 5-year plus period to happen in a 2 to 5 month period. I think the question around remote workforce and working from home is one where the history books are going to take a little while to write that one. I think the initial reaction of we have to figure out how to do this, let's do it. And then the secondary reaction on that of, hey, this isn't that bad. I don't have to commute. Zoom works really well. There are obviously other alternatives that work equally well. And somehow we can kind of keep this whole thing going. We're past that point now. And I think there are some companies that are saying, you know what, from a productivity point of view, this isn't working as well as we had hoped. There's obviously a number of people that are in a situation where they're having to take care of their children's schooling from home, their day-to-day job, and perhaps even their parents, which is just not, that it's no way to run a railroad if you had the choice. And so I think it remains to be seen. My best guess, and I've talked to a couple real estate firms about this, their best guess is that we're going to see something that looks like much more of a hybrid workforce with more remote locations that are perhaps in suburban locations where people can come for some period of time, with things set up in the downtown locations again so that people can come in and out, and more of a willingness to allow for work from home with all of the expectation of productivity that you would expect from somebody in the office.
That seems like it makes sense. And I think back to, say, someone like Peter Drucker, be effective first, and if you could be efficient, great. What kind of I'm noticing is if there's an experienced workforce, they're dedicated, and there's the right culture, this might even be an improvement because it could potentially be more efficient both for people and companies. But I'll ask you the question from a McKinsey perspective, where it's definitely not as good. I know I see it in single family offices, is hiring new young talent, which you need to bring on, but how do you coach and mentor them if you're not as much face to face? How has that worked out at McKinsey, hiring?
I think hiring, again, it's too soon to tell how it's going to work in terms of end result. It has worked fine in terms of our ability to hire. We are now in the process of onboarding our first group of associates and others around the world. And, it's hard, full stop. Andrew, I'm hoping my internet connects. There seems to be, hopefully I'm coming through.
Yes, your video was freezing up a little bit, but your audio was perfect. So we'll cross our fingers. So far.
I'm going to keep on talking.
Yes.
Okay. We have not had this problem in a while, but timing is everything. Of course, it'll come out in the middle of a video cast or a podcast. So we're now in the process of really onboarding our first class, and we'll see. I did some of the early sessions. You can have a very informed conversation by Zoom, as you know, but the day-to-day osmosis of what happens in the taxi cab or the Uber, what happens when you're all sitting around the team room, those things are going to be a lot harder. I think we'll be fine for a year. I would not want to do this indefinitely.
And going back a little bit to your experience in initiating and heading up the private equity practice and how valuable that could be, since again, many of our members, our relationships are substantial family businesses, and at minimum, either or that, or investors in private equity and businesses. What are some of the lessons that you learned working with the founders and partners of such organizations, and how they accepted your strategy and how they implemented it? What are some takeaways that maybe single family offices could learn from?
Well, I start with kind of the big one, which I mentioned a moment ago, which is this notion of where you get the owners of capital, management that is incented by that capital in a fairly direct way, and a time frame of, call it 5 to 7 years, where you need to make stuff happen. That's a very powerful combination for driving transformational change in a company. And so that was probably my first and biggest learning, which is and that's not to say that public companies can't do all of those things, but you are naturally set up for success. You still have to do hard work to get there, but you're naturally set up for success. Second thing I've learned is a bad investment decision. Either you got the market timing completely off, you grossly overpaid, you were in the wrong market. It's really hard to overcome that through a lot of hard work afterwards. You can mitigate some of the damage, but getting it right, at least point it in the right direction, having a sensible investment thesis that more or less plays out, is kind of mission one. And then after that, all of the operational improvement is where you can really goose the returns. Now, your investment thesis can be driven off an operational improvement thesis. So those two things can be very much tied together, but you got to get that more or less right to begin with. Third, and it touches a little on your question to me about building the private equity practice. I have found, working with the founders of a number of private equity firms, that there is an iconoclasm in the way they think. It's like any entrepreneur. They're willing to move in and do something different. They believed they had a different offering, and particularly the early stage of private equity founders, the ones that did start doing it 30 years ago as the industry was still pretty nascent. They were truly pioneers, and they were willing to ignore kind of taking the easy path. And if you're going to run firms that are driven by talent, you have to allow for the possibility that that talent will have a better idea than the one that you came in with. And, to your question, would I allow a McKinsey person, now that I'm a senior guy, to go do something against my advice? Absolutely. As long as what they were doing was perfectly ethical and perfectly legal, and I thought it was a perfectly bad idea, I would absolutely allow them to go pursue it, because there's a decent chance I'm wrong and they're right. And the only way to find that out is to have them prove it. And I think the early founders of these firms had that same sort of mindset and cultural value.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back a little bit to having a beginner's mindset, putting your ego at the door, realizing that you should be a lifelong learner. And sometimes a junior person may simply have a better twist or a better solution or idea than you. But I admit, as we get older and we've had a level of success in what we're doing, that does become harder. We need to actively fight against that. And the fact that that is embedded in the culture of the best idea wins, and what you just described in McKinsey, is probably one of the reasons why they are McKinsey. And you and the whole team going back decades have done a great job. How do you look at and evaluate private companies in terms of a big three that I talk about in single family offices? And this is sequential. People, number one; systems, now more important than ever, number two; and technology, number three. Now, again, in my world of the substantial family business, or more importantly, a family office, that is critical. The quality of your people, I think, by a wide margin is number one. When you're working with companies, public or private, is there a little bit of a pattern that you look at in terms of separating people, systems, technology, or something else?
Well, so I don't disagree with your hierarchy. I will say, remember, we're providing diligent support for a private equity firm looking at a particular investment. We do some work in venture, but it's relatively limited. So most of this is reasonably big ticket items. In my mind, one of the biggest differences between what I'll call buyouts and venture is venture, you can start with a small investment and then just continue to roll it as the thing proves itself out. So you're basically buying a fair bit of option value. In the buyout world, you've got to make a single big decision. You may add on decisions after that, but there's a big equity check. So you want to get that part of the decision right the first time. You're not really buying option value. And so in that world, they tend to do more of the people analysis than we would. We tend to be asked to have a point of view on addressable market, relative competitive position, strategic opportunities, operational improvement opportunities relative to their starting point. And then if we've got a personal point of view on the management team, we will of course share it, but that tends to be a little more their job. We do have a very good diagnostic tool we call the Organizational Health Index to evaluate systems. It's not specific to people, but it is what are the governance systems? How does this company actually run itself? How aligned are they with different recipes for success, which we'll use periodically in diligence, and then almost always as one of the first steps as we're about to start transformational work with the company. And then IT systems is your classic, as you say. Most, I think, of the buyout firms are looking at IT systems not as a source of competitive advantage, but just to make sure there's not some mine there that's ready to blow up post acquisition. They can become a source of competitive advantage, but usually they're focusing more on the risk management component of IT systems.
To some degree, I would assume that, and looking broadly at McKinsey, whether it's private equity, a large private company, or a public company, to some degree, you're brought in to solve problems, to look at strategic opportunities and offer guidance that is, you're stepped away from the situation. Sometimes when you're too deep into it, you don't see some of the obvious. And I even mentioned a little bit of that in my opening. That comes down to me a little bit to critical thinking. So solving problems and being a critical thinker, obviously that's ingrained in some of the training and some of the support you have at McKinsey. But these are the key things that you're working with in these private equity firms. In your case, is how do you see opportunity? How do you solve problems? And how do you think about this critically?
Angelo, the firm that I joined was 90% what you just described. It was all about problem-solving technique and one's ability to do critical thinking. And then maybe even just we worked a little harder, came in a little earlier and left a little later than the companies that we were serving. We have become, and I would say this is true for the private equity world also, much more expertise driven. And that expertise could be in particular industry sectors, or it could be in particular functions or particular geographies, or at our best, that intersection. Semiconductor manufacturing in Singapore as a particular skill and expertise. How do you drive performance improvement there? And so critical reasoning is always going to be an underlying, it's almost a foundational capability. But at this point, that starts to become table stakes, and developing this very real capability-driven expertise is what allows us, I think, to differentiate ourselves on top of the critical thinking. And I would say that's true for most private equity firms now. They really have built, either they are dedicated to a particular expertise or they have built multiple expertises.
Trying to relate my next question, which is a big issue inside substantial family businesses and their family offices, but with your private equity experience, with them investing in private companies, you must have saw some of this as well. And it's a touchy subject inside the family office community. And that basically is what's the next generation, the rising generation in a substantial family business that potentially creates unique opportunity, insight, family experiences, but there could be nepotism and there could be other challenges. How did you look at that from your role?
You're talking less about family offices and more about the family businesses themselves?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So I think the best family, well, let me start with stuff that is pretty well substantiated by the data and then I'll offer a point of view. Family businesses tend to be more conservative. They invest and treat the business as though it was their own money, for the obvious reason that it is their own money. And over time, that I think serves them well. There are particular points in time where being overly conservative can actually cause you to really stultify. Family businesses are very thoughtful about capital expenditure. They tend to run lower expense, lower capital expense organizations. They are, as a whole, pretty thoughtful about management and talent. They have a, generally speaking, again, paternalistic attitude in the most positive sense to the people they hire. So they view these as long-term relationships with their people. They are not transactional. And if you look at the employees in most family-owned companies, or at least very many family-owned companies, they've been there for a long period of time. They are committed to the company, and that's a very big source of cultural strength for these companies. The ones that survive over extended periods of time, particularly when you start to get multiple cousins and the family branch just continues to roll out, come up with a system for not necessarily keeping the family out of the company, but ensuring that there is a constant flow of new talent into the company and that the governance mechanisms allow and encourage that new talent to come into the company. And a little bit of may the best person win, not just made the best family member win, or whoever is a family member win. And I'm talking about those that survive over an extended period of time.
It pops in my mind because, again, working with public companies, you're used to, for sure, a certain hierarchy. There's the board of directors, there's the CEO, there's C-level executives. It gets complicated in the world of family businesses and in family offices, especially if the founder and wealth creator, the entrepreneur, is still around. They tend to treat it like a kingdom, which is a simple form of governance. It has the advantage for that, but it likely is one not to pass down properly, especially if there's multiple children. It's not inclusive enough. You probably don't see that as much per se in some of the larger companies that you deal with. Might have saw it in some of your private equity role, working with private equity firms and companies they invest in. So that would be, to me, that must be an interesting perspective. How important is governance, which is how decisions are made? I'm assuming you want to clearly understand what's the hierarchy of this organization and effectively, what is your governance? How do you make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, if you are a single business unit company operating in a limited number of geographies with an incredibly capable CEO that more or less operates as the king or queen, that model can work indefinitely. As you increase complexity, both of scale and scope, that just gets harder to do unless you're truly exceptional. And I've seen a few companies do it. I've seen a few try to make that transition without actually changing the organizational model, and they struggle. I would say most family-owned companies, at least as they move to the second or third generation, do shift the governance model to look more like a traditional private company who is not family-owned. And the board of directors typically will have external members of the board that provide, even while the family has not lost control at all, they will typically have a minority share of external directors. They will ensure that there's a flow of external talent at very senior levels into the company. And they treat them almost as though they are part of the family for the purposes of expectation that they will be there for the long haul.
In the boutique book market, many years ago, I tried to find it so I could hold it up. I couldn't find it. It's somewhere around my home. Is an iconic book within your community. And probably when you joined in 87, you probably had to go through some of the training and work of Barbara Minto. You probably didn't think I was going to bring up that name, did you?
No, I have not heard Barbara's name in a while. I remember her well. I actually knew Barbara.
If you could talk a little bit about how foundational that education was, and although it's a bit of a complex subject, if you could easily describe inductive and deductive reasoning, that may be helpful for our audience.
Sure. I'll try to do it as simply as Barbara would have done. I heard in today's world, her videos would all be available on YouTube. I'm not sure.
It'd be a different world, yeah.
But we had them at McKinsey. Good memory to bring that out, Angelo. So Barbara's key insight was less about problem solving and more about communication. And her feeling, and I fully agree with this, is fabulous problem solving combined with lousy communication is very unlikely to guarantee success as a consultant. That was partially grounded in a world where the result of a McKinsey project was a blue book, and the book had a blue cover on it, a blue book of recommendations. And so the question was, how do you communicate those recommendations in a way that is compelling? Much of our work now is actually implementation oriented, so that things have changed a little. But just to go back to your question, Barbara's insight was that the deductive reasoning that took you to the answer, that if this, then this, then this, and therefore this, was not the way you wanted to communicate. You exhausted your audience by the time you got to the conclusion. So her insight was you communicated inductively, communicate with the top line conclusion up front, then have, I believe that because of this, this, and this, I believe this because of doom, boom, boom, boom. And so you laid out sort of a pyramid, and she actually called the book that she wrote the pyramid principle. And it started with this top line message, and then had all the building blocks that led up to it, rather than this sort of linear progression of deductive thinking. But again, it was less a problem-solving approach and more a communication approach.
Well, that's a great approach even today. When it comes down to families, often wealth dissolves within 3 generations, less to do with investing in taxes, but that could be a part of it, and more due to internal squabble, not working together, litigation, divorce, making bad decisions. And a lot of that comes down to very simply communication, respect and listening to the other party. And for some reason, that seems to be a challenge, unfortunately, inside many families. You said something that I thought was interesting. When I think of McKinsey, I do think of problem solving. I do think of being progressive on strategy. But you mentioned that times have evolved and you're now, or the firm is more active in execution. If you could describe that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, the McKinsey I joined was what I'll call a question answer firm. You had a question, we provided an answer. And so therefore we were insight driven with a lot of first principles problem solving. The McKinsey we are now is really an insight to implementation firm. That is, we get paid for not just having the insight, but from actually driving that insight or multiple insights through the relevant parts of the organization until they've been executed against. And in fact, I think about 25%, maybe more, of our fees right now are tied entirely to the results that we deliver. And We're very comfortable doing that. That's also a completely new innovation. We were very much a time and materials firm historically, but we've said as long as we're involved through execution, we're happy to have our fees tied to what we deliver. And not surprisingly, that's been very attractive for private equity firms.
You obviously, McKinsey is at the top of the heap when you mention global consulting companies. There's others and they're fine, and we would know their names. But there was an entrant about 20 or so years ago that has a unique model, and that's driven by effectively connecting with outside experts, kind of the GLG model. in my backyard in New York. But you guys are much deeper than just simply we're going to connect you even internally with quote unquote a problem solving expert. It really is going to come down to working on the execution part. And there's motivation from what you just said for that execution to be successful. How does a team, and it sounds like it's not just one person, how does a team of the right partners and the people around them work with an organization? Like, how did you work with some of the substantial private equity firms? Did you build a team that you think was going to be most applicable on strategy and then execution? Did you supervise it, quarterback it? How hands-on were you?
It's a really interesting question. We have increasingly moved to a model where there's a core team of people that serve a particular client that have real expertise in them and typically the sector in which they operate. And then we supplement that team with all of the different skills we need for a particular client. So if we need operations capability, we'll bring in manufacturing capability, or we'll bring in supply chain capability. If we need a very particular type of strategy, we'll bring in that strategic capability. And so what we do now is very much assemble a fit to purpose team for the particular piece of work that we're doing. And then if it makes sense, they'll stay involved in the client. If it doesn't, they'll disappear and serve another client in a different industry or a different sector. And so it's very much the old model of, I used to say the old model at McKinsey was, two guys and a dog. And that was how we served you. It was always two partners, and no matter what the question was, they knew the answer. The model has evolved now to multi-partner client service teams that then pull from the rest of the McKinsey ecosystem. And then to your point, also use expert networks and others outside the firm as appropriate to supplement the work that we're doing.
No, that's very valuable. To quote the great book of Jim Collins, Good to Great, I think it's moderately easy to identify, in my world of the single family office community at least, how to go from average to good, possibly how to go to good to very good. But that leap from kind of good to great to be in the top 1 or 2% at what you do as a company, it's incredibly hard. Otherwise, I guess everyone would be doing it. It's not as simple as, here's 6 things you have to do, resilience, you got to do this, you got to do that. How do you, and this is, I'm assuming, some of the things that McKinsey helps, the relationships that it works with. What is important to you? What are you good at? But what do you need to be great at? And how do you get there?
I think you're at kind of the hardest thing you can possibly do. And I don't want to take anything away from turnarounds or good to very good, but this notion of going from, hey, we're a very, reasonably high performing company that wants to be the highest performing company in our industry is a very tough leap. Not because it's so hard to be the highest performing company in a particular industry, although arguably that in and of itself is really difficult, but making that transition from when things are going really well to being willing to essentially blow up parts of yourself to make them go even better. That's hard, right? That's discomforting to do. It's hard to get a institutional momentum around them. And, we're innately as people, most of us at least, conservative. If it's working really well, why look to change it? And so, first and foremost, and Jim talks about this in his book. Actually, let me give you a total aside, Angelo, and I'll apologize for going on. But that book was prompted by a dinner that Angelo was having I don't remember the setting, but he was actually sitting next to one of my former partners who's since retired. And it was prompted by Collins's original book, which was much more around how do you take a lousy company and make it good. And my partner said to him, "That's easy, Jim. How do you go from good to great?" And that became, I think you could probably find it in the book notes for the book. Now, my partner posed the question because I'm not sure he knew the answer. And I'll plead a little humility to myself. It's hard, right? You have to start with a new goal that you can't get to from here. So just continuing to do what you do, no matter how good it is, if you want to make that leap to something much greater, you've got to start with a goal that looks that great. And then you almost certainly have to get there discontinuously. You can't just do everything you do a little better in order to make that. You have to jolt parts of the business to rethink the way they operate. Almost to go back to where we originally began this discussion around COVID-19 and the jolt that's provided for many businesses. You've got to create your own version of COVID-19 that forces you to jolt the business in different and very uncomfortable ways to go after some larger goal that you can't get to on a more incremental path.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to actually bring that up. That's going kind of linear, which in some industries or some certain situations could work, and it's the more common. But there are times when that's not good enough, where it needs to be exponential. But if you have the same people doing the same thinking, it's probably going to be hard to get more than linear growth. But that's one of the advantages of bringing in an organization like yours to think about the problem differently and perhaps not even change the people that you have, although maybe, but it simply is that we're looking at it differently. Here's an idea, and we'll even, now that you guys help execute, we'll even help you execute it.
I think that's well said. And I generally believe if you've got management that's performing very well in this incredibly complicated and difficult world, and I don't just mean currently, I mean more generally, right? It's tough to keep winning in business. If you've got management that's been winning for a while, they're probably very good. And so you want to figure out a way to have the discontinuous jolt, but still be able to keep that management team in place and drive it to somewhere that they hadn't been before.
I am going to quote the iconic Peter Drucker, but he originated this probably 50 plus years ago. Does it still hold true, or times have changed? And that would be culture eats strategy for breakfast.
It goes to my point about insights to implementation. I think if you say culture drives, I think this is implicit in Peter's quote, which is if you say culture drives execution, and execution eats strategy for breakfast, you're probably not too far off from the truth, right? You can have a great strategy, and if you execute poorly, it's completely irrelevant. The only flip side to that is you can have a lousy strategy, and executing really well against it isn't going to do you much good either. And it goes back to that point I was making a moment ago, where the critical investment part of the investment decision is getting the investment decision right. You can't solve for a lousy company in a lousy industry enough to make money on it, right? You can get out with your shirt on, but you're not gonna make any real money on it. And so I agree, culture eats strategy for breakfast, but if you don't have strategy, if you're not pointed the right way or can't find a way to get yourself pointed the right way, executing at 100 miles per hour the wrong direction is rarely going to serve you well either.
I would think so. I'm thinking back to when you first came into McKinsey in the mid 80s. Who were some of the iconic business leaders? There were many, but off the top of my head, Jack Welch, Lee Iacocca. And to me, as an amateur looking from the outside in, and I was younger then, dynamic personalities, dynamic speakers. They almost had like a head football coach kind of feel to them. And I enjoyed that. But I'm thinking in today's world where there's issues in diversity, everything you say, the Twitter and social media, and just simply the times have changed. Millennials are different than baby boomers. Generation Z is going to be different. I'm going to assume that they would have adapted to today's times and been a great leader. But looking back to when you first joined McKinsey in '87 to now, how has leadership in companies changed?
Well, let me challenge your premise a little on that, which is I think every decade has very visible, iconic leaders. And those are the ones that you see the most because they're out there the most. And they still have to run their company, but part of their management leadership is being very visible on the world stage. I think there's been a belief now that you can, the more introverted, less self-aggrandizing, if you'll bear with me in terms of my pronunciation, CEO that we're much more tolerant of that. I think both still continue to exist. I think you could point to a whole host of very visible CEOs around the world, certainly in the Silicon Valley, that have made themselves a major part of the story of their company. And you could say that served them and their company well, particularly if you think about a number of the entrepreneurs. I do think, though, the world has absolutely allowed for that quiet, successful, we're going to let the product and the company speak for itself, as opposed to me having to be the most visible part of who and what we do, is very much an accepted model. And in a world where you can find a way to still be visible without having to be on the front page through social media, through, I would just say technology writ large, you can see many different leadership styles working. If I then go to the end part of your question, the biggest shift I've seen, particularly of CEOs of large companies, is back in the day, they really were driving in many ways every part of the company. They were involved all the way. And so if I think about our work back in the 80s, the vast majority of it was for the CEO or for the C-suite and then rolling down from there. And what's happened increasingly is lots and lots of empowered, what would have been mid-level managers that are meant to be driving their parts of the business without direct interaction with the CEO. And many of CEOs have moved into more of a statesman-like role of dealing with policy and dealing with symbolic leadership, et cetera. They still are required to make some big decisions, but they are not operating the day-to-day company in the same way that maybe would have been true 30 years ago. And that I think is a positive. It allows lots more innovation to go on at lots of other places in the company.
It's my final question. It's probably going to be a comment, but there's a question in here somewhere. And I know it's not going to be your core area of past experience, but in some ways that's good. You're looking at it from a different perspective. And that's going to be directly my world of the single family office. Usually, originally, you have the elder, the wealth creator. They created a company. They ran it with rigor. They spent money on top people. They maybe even had outside consultants like yourself and others. Yet somehow now at a liquidity event, let's call it a clean $1 billion, they now have a family office that really is their new family enterprise, their legacy, their wealth, and it's big. Whether it's 100 million or 60 billion, it represents a tremendous amount of money. Yet often it is not run the same as they ran the family business. We're not even talking about setting up proper structures and even proper governance. They hire someone who's a family friend. They trust, but maybe they're not an A++ player just to get things off the ground. It's comfortable, it's safe, but it's a very siloed community. It's very private. You don't have access to what's going on around the world. You're often in technology, but that's gotten better over the years. We've seen a change with the big hedge fund and private equity managers creating their SFOs going back probably 10 or 15 years ago. It's more rigorous. It's more institutional. There's less nepotism. It's held to a higher standard. There's boards and mentors to help the executives. Everyone is held to, and people are paid properly. That's important as well. So somewhere in there, there's a question, but there's going to be family office consultants that are going to watch this video that are going to want to learn from someone of your stature at McKinsey. What are certain principles that you may recommend to them that they could help family offices be more effective, more efficient, and be more productive?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and as you say, comfortably outside my area of expertise. But nonetheless, I'll offer a couple of points of view. You touched on it, with one word you used, Angelo, which was trust. When McKinsey started, which was James O. McKinsey, but really Marvin Bower created the modern McKinsey and really modern management consulting. The core insight he had was that you needed to be a true professional to do what we did. You had to have the absolute trust at that point, really, of the CEO, because all our work was in some form for the CEO. And in order to have that trust, you needed to be entirely of service to them. And so when I joined the firm, they drilled it into you. It was client, firm, self, in terms of how you thought about your priorities and where you needed to make sure that you optimized your time and your attention. And if there was a decision that had to be made, client came first, firm came second, self came third. It almost sounds funny to say that in the modern world, right? Because we're so self-actualized, since then. But that was very much the mindset, and I'd like to believe it still is the McKinsey mindset. And so, my first and core principle would be: if you're providing service to a family office, the individual or individuals at that family office must believe that you're always putting their interest above your own interest. And first and foremost, that's got to be clear. And you've got to live that and act it, not just assert it. And at that point, then you create the trust. And I think what you talked about a moment ago was the reason why people defer to somebody they know well, who may not be the quote unquote perfect person, is because they trust them. And so you've got to create trust by putting their interest ahead of yours, number one. Two, I do think I am a big believer, and I think you implied it in what you said, that putting in place good process and structure actually gives you the ability to go free form. So process and structure doesn't necessarily mean hard and fast rules of it's got to be done this way, then boom, boom, boom. It just provides a frame so people know how things operate, and it provides a touchstone that you can go back to. That being said, I think having a clear set of values for the family office of what is it we're trying to do, what are we optimizing for, and the people who come to work for us have to live those values, and spending real time talking about when are we not living up to our values, when are we operating in a way that feels inconsistent. You're really having the debate and discussion, so the values aren't just something on the wall, they're actually something that people choose to live. So governance and process will take you some part of the way, but if that can also be stultifying if you're not careful. Values are what allow you to actually make decisions in a way that people get what the other person is trying to do. And then I guess my last thought is, I think the best family offices do have an integrated view to here's what we're trying to do. Oftentimes they do still have a stake in the core business, or maybe even own the majority of the core business, have a point of view on what we're trying to do with operating the core business, have a point of view with what we're trying to do with the rest of our investments, have a point of view of what we're doing philanthropically. And that's all under this banner of family office. But thinking about each of those things a bit independently, when you start trying to combine them together, I think there's a real risk that the thinking gets muddled. And so you want to make sure that those are, my vision of that is almost the Olympic circles, right? That you've got multiple circles of what you're trying to do in the family office, or what the family office exists for, and they overlap with each other, but they are by no means one circle all layered on top of each other.
There's a practice in consulting circles, probably more so in much, much smaller businesses than what you deal with, called tabletop exercise. I've dabbled in a little bit of it with certain family offices. It basically is playing out stress testing, what if scenario. What if this were to happen? What if COVID were to happen? What if the principal gets on a ventilator? Do you really have the tax, the estate plan, the governance, how decisions are going to be made? The problem that I notice is when the principal is the one leading that, it could make the lead executive in the family office a little nervous, like, oh, they're coming here to poke holes. Now, the right attitude to have is, I'm not perfect. We all have blind spots. I want to get better. But reality is human nature sets in. I don't know if you had to go through versions of that at McKinsey, meaning when you come in, maybe by a very, very senior person of a private equity or firm, but there may be people in that person's inner circle that are threatened by that. Do you pick up on that? And how do you maybe get them to come on board and realize we're here for the betterment of everyone?
You know, it's funny. We did a piece of work for one of my private equity clients a number of years ago, and it was a full review of their investment process, from beginning to end, to figure out when they had made mistakes before, where were the mistakes made. And what we found was there were multiple things. I won't bore you with all the detail, but one in particular was when they were in the investment review committee, if one of the two co-founders spoke early in the conversation and offered their point of view on something, that basically became the rest of the discussion. And we had multiple recommendations, some of which were very micro, but our largest and most important one to them was, if you're going to be in the investment review committee, you need to sit and listen for a long time, unless you're 100% certain you're right and you just want to cut the conversation off. Because even if you don't mean to, the moment you've weighed in strongly on something, it effectively becomes the answer. And I'd offer that same piece of advice, which is the longer you can sit on your hands and listen to everybody else, the more you're actually going to learn.
That's great advice. Again, I want to be respectful of your time. For those that would like to, everyone knows McKinsey, but I know there's some great also free resources and white papers and other sources. I'm assuming they could go to mckinsey.com.
McKinsey.com, or anybody's welcome to reach out to me directly. We actually do have a family business practice, which has a family office component to it. And so I'm happy to share more thoughts and perspectives, but the McKinsey.com website's been completely revamped. So I'd be interested in people's impressions of it if they get on and start navigating. And there's been a lot of publishing in and around COVID from when we couldn't travel anymore, we had a lot more time to write. And you'll see the fruits of that. You'll see the fruits of that writing on the website.
You actually beat me to the punch of my closing, which takes about 90 seconds. Hopefully you'll stay with me, Gary. Everyone, my name is Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles Podcast and the founder and CEO of Greenwich, Connecticut-based Family Office Association. In simple terms, we're a global membership organization dedicated to single-family offices. Just what Gary said. My next comment in terms of what do we do, I do a significant amount, arguably more than anyone else in the world, of original proprietary content. And part of the reason that is during COVID-19, I'm not traveling on a plane 25 times a year. I actually have the time to be more thoughtful and have more creative thoughts that I organize in family office onshore and offshore structures. We did a very deep dive today. I spoke about my interest via wealth preservation, store money in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, what we're doing on families setting up offshore operations, buying banks in Switzerland, setting up insurance companies. I just didn't have the time to do much of that pre-COVID. So the other thing that we do, I would have said we host events. I've been fortunate to interview people like Tony Robbins, Ray Dalio, Peter Thiel, and many others, but that's on hold. But 200 times a year, I'm doing digital events like I'm doing today. So in many ways, we're more thoughtful and we're more active than ever before. I do take on a couple of consulting assignments a year. They're usually on creating a single family office. And I just gave you some of my secret insights about onshore and offshore and some other initiatives that I do, or reinventing during a time of crisis. I'm very active on social media, YouTube or Family Office. We're very active on LinkedIn and Instagram. And my new website is familyofficeassociation.com. And my direct email is angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. Gary, this has been incredibly insightful. I took notes. I learned so much. I want to watch this video myself so I can incorporate some of what you said and get better in terms of what I do. Thank you so much for your time.
Angelo, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.